Hello gang, and welcome to the very first episode of the Fear the Platypus YouTube channel. In honor of our Halloween premiere, I present to you the Pumpkin King, a 30-foot tall monster that rises from the pumpkin patch on Halloween night to terrorize adventurers who are unlucky enough to pass by it while traveling after dark. The Pumpkin King is a relatively easy build and can be used to add a Halloween-themed monster to any fantasy tabletop RPG. I'm releasing the video in 2 parts because of time, but don't worry, the second part will be coming soon, so you won't have to wait too long. So, let's get started with the Pumpkin King Part 1. So, for this project, I had found a pumpkin at the dollar store made out of styrofoam, and as you can see, it really has that bumpy styrofoam texture and has a couple of really bad seams on the sides and the top and the bottom. So I knew I wanted to take the stem off to make it easier to work with the pumpkin, but I didn't know a lot about the pumpkin, so I was trying to be very careful. I knew that the stem was being held on by hot glue, but as I worked with it and was able to get the stem to come off, I found there was a toothpick that was holding it on there to help with stability. But you'll see I've marred up the top of it, removing it. So I've taken my Liquitex flexible modeling paste and I want to just kind of fill in the hole that I left there by pulling that stem off. And I want to cover the entire pumpkin because I want to get rid of that texture and I want to cover those seams. And this stuff gets really gloopy after a while as you're using it, so I do recommend you have some water to kind of help even it out and thin it a little bit to make it go on smoother. Now I used a barbecue skewer and put it through the bottom of the pumpkin to try and hold it while I was putting on the paste, and I found that the pumpkin actually was hollow, so I went ahead and cut it at the seams and opened it up and painted the inside of it black. And then I took hot glue and just glued it back together and then used the paste to go ahead and cover the seams back up. And as you can see, I've cut the eyes and the nose and the mouth out while I had it open. Now the Liquitex modeling paste does wind up leaving a lot of texture here, but unlike the styrofoam, at least with this texture, we can take sandpaper. And I started with an 80 grit and worked my way to a 220. And as you can see, my cat is thrilled. And I black bombed it once it was sanded nice and smooth. So that way when I paint it orange, it's more of a darker, deeper orange. Now I've put parchment paper down here, and there's a reason for that we'll get to in a moment. But what I wanted to do here was I wanted to make a pattern for arms and legs. And so I got out my 90-degree angle, and I knew I wanted the arms to be at about 90 degrees, but I also knew I wanted the legs to be a different angle because I thought 90-degree legs were going to be difficult to get this thing to stand. So what I did was just made a couple of wider angles, and I really didn't have anything where I knew that the angles were going to match. I just tried to match them up the best I could, and then I got out of the protractor and checked them. One was 112 degrees and one was 118 degrees, so I knew that they were going to work out pretty good. So I've got a couple of dowel rods here, and I'm going to cut those into pieces, and I need 8 pieces, 2 for each leg, 2 for each arm. And I've cut the dowel rods at 3-inch lengths. Now I've taken hot glue and put a dab in the joint there of that 90-degree angle, and then I'm just taking the dowel rods and putting them over the lines that I drew, so that way I've got that angle pretty good. And then I just take the hot glue and go over that joint to really help seal that together. And this is why the parchment paper is being used, because hot glue will not stick to parchment paper. So it makes this kind of work nice because you can use the hot glue and then just peel your work right off of it. Now make sure that you let everything cool after you've used hot glue, because as you can see, it kind of just blobs into a mess, and that's not going to work well for our next step here. Now you can see I've taken 1-inch pieces of dowel rod and added them to the shoulder joints of the arms, and I actually wound up cutting these down to 1/2 inch when I went to use them, but I realized I wanted something at the shoulder joints and at the hip joints of the legs to actually stick into the pumpkin, so that way I had extra support. And what I'm doing now is I'm just taking the hot glue gun, running it down the sides, and running it across the tops of the arms and then of the legs. And what I'm doing here is just building texture on these arms and legs, because I didn't just want plain old sticks. Even when they're painted, if they're untextured, they're not going to look the way I wanted them to look, which was I wanted them to be stringy and viney and just kind of have that vine look that you would find with a pumpkin in a pumpkin patch. And I just go over it about 3 or 4 times, letting it cool in between and letting it build itself up. So then I've taken them and flipped them around, and now I'm going to do the other sides. And it's going to be the same technique, just filling up texture and allowing it to cool in between. And again, you'll do this about 3 or 4 times to get the entire thing built up, and let it cool in between applications, because hot glue just makes a hot glue mess if you don't, and you're not going to get the texture you're looking for unless you let it cool in between applications. So at this point, I would like to apologize, because to paint the pumpkin I used my airbrush, and I don't currently have a good setup to record video of me airbrushing, so there's no actual footage of the painting process. So instead, I'm going to try to distract you with something we all love: dice. So here we've taken the legs, and I've taken a punch and punched in on each side where the arms are going to go, and then at the bottom where the legs are going to go. And I've just taken these legs and those rods that we added to the hip joint and just stuck it in there, and now I'm just using hot glue to really build up in that area to hold these. And you'll see here's a different angle, just globbing it on, because I knew that I didn't want this thing to have to be supported by some kind of a dowel rod coming out of the back of it onto the base. So I really wanted these legs to be strong, and just a couple of applications of those and letting them cool in between. Now, what I'm doing here is kind of a feathering technique. And all I'm doing is taking the hot glue gun and just lightly squeezing glue out as I run from the leg to the base of the pumpkin, so that way I'm building a texture that's not that hot glue glob. And this doesn't necessarily change the look of it right away, but when you paint this, all that you're going to see is this texture. And it really helps to blend in these legs and the arms. We do it with the arms also. Really just helps blend them into this body and make it look like it's all one creature instead of a bunch of things just hot glued together. And just again, it's lightly squeezing the trigger, just barely bringing some glue out, allowing the glue gun itself to kind of melt into some of that glue that's already on there, and adding other glue to it to just kind of feather everything together. And it really does make a great look when it's done. So we've got a 6x6 base that I've made out of double cardboard because this is a relatively huge creature. And I've just taken the legs and glued them to the base and then used that same feathering technique to make these legs look like they're coming up out of the ground. And I've got my Elmer's glue all, PVA white glue, and I'm just going to apply it to the base here, and then I'm going to take a paintbrush, and I have a special paintbrush that I use for the gluing techniques because I don't want to use the same paintbrush to paint minis and vice versa. So just apply a liberal amount of glue all around, smear it around the entire base, because what we're going to do now is take some rocks that I've gotten these out of the parking lot where I live, and it also has some aquarium gravel in it, so there's different sized rocks in this. And I've just got a cup full of some of them. I have a whole thing of these, a whole bucket of these here at my house that I use for texturing bases. Just kind of spread them out around in the glue, and then take just regular play sand that you can buy at anywhere from local hardware stores, and just a couple of cups of that. Run it across the entire base and pour it on thick, because the glue is going to soak into the sand. The sand's going to stick to the glue. And the reason that you use the paintbrush is because if you just put globs of the white glue down, it's really obvious if you don't spread that glue out. So once we've got this all covered in sand, we're going to let it sit. I recommend at the absolute least half an hour, but usually I let it sit for a good 2, maybe 3 hours before I'll do this, where I'm just taking it and dumping that sand off, the sand that didn't get glued down, because I don't want all that sand just roaming around on there. So I'm just taking it, shaking it off. I'll take a paintbrush and just kind of brush across it to help get any other loose bits that didn't come off with the shaking. And we do this over the plates, that way we can put that back in our bucket and use it again later. And what I'm doing now is I've just got a mix of the Elmer's glue with a water, it's a 50-50 mix. I've got it in a spray bottle, and I just spray this really good, and then I'll take a brush. And you've got to be careful, because when you do this, the water and glue can kind of activate the glue that you've already put down before the sand, and kind of start making this stuff come loose until it starts drying. So when you're using the brush, just kind of dab and be very gentle. And then another trip to the airbrush booth, and the arms and legs have been based with a bark brown. Then I lightly sprayed it with a foliage green and then a leaf green. The base I sprayed with an earth brown and then lightly sprayed with a foliage green. And then I'm going to be adding flock to the base, but painting these colors helps in blending the areas where the flock may be lighter coverage than other areas. It also helps in case, through the wear and tear at the table, bits of the flocking fall off over time. So we're going to be coming back in part 2, and we'll work on finishing up this pumpkin. So there you have it, gang. Part 1 of my take on the Pumpkin King. Don't forget to keep your eye out for part 2 coming within the next few days. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button, and even share it with a friend. While you're here, drop a comment in the belows, And hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to click on the bell so that way you're notified when part 2 of the video comes out. In the meantime, happy crafting, happy gaming, and thank you for spending your time with me. I'm Fear the Platypus. This one is done.